Commander Tyver's Call stood in the great chamber of the Galactic Coalition and watched the human delegation enter through the western gates. He had seen many species in his 300 years of military service, but these creatures made him want to laugh out loud. They were small and soft, with no natural armor covering their pink flesh, and no claws extending from their blunt fingers, and no venom glands visible anywhere on their bodies. The Vraxian commander towered over them by nearly 2 meters, and his forearms crossed over his chest as his iridescent scales shifted from blue to purple in barely hidden contempt. His people had conquered 17 star systems through superior strength and unmatched combat ability, and now the Coalition expected them to fight alongside these fragile beings. The human ambassador was a female with brown hair and warm eyes who smiled far too much for a war council, and Tyverus found this deeply unsettling. Did she not understand that the Devour Swarm had already consumed 40 inhabited worlds, and that billions of sentient beings had been torn apart and absorbed into the hive mind? Yet she smiled and extended her small hand in what humans called a greeting gesture. Tyverus did not take it. High Admiral Vex of the Crethony spoke from the central platform, and her crystalline voice echoed through the chamber. She explained that the Coalition had voted to accept humanity into their alliance against the Devourers, and that Earth would contribute ships and soldiers to the war effort. Tyverus felt his scales darken with anger, because he had argued against this decision for months. He had studied the human species extensively, and everything he learned confirmed his belief that they were unsuitable for war. They were slow runners compared to most sentient species, and their reaction times were mediocre at best, and in individual combat a single Vraxian child could tear apart 3 human adults without breaking a sweat. Their bones broke easily, and their skin tore like paper, and they required constant intake of food and water and sleep just to function. They came from a single world that they had nearly destroyed through their own stupidity, and they had only achieved faster than light travel a mere century ago. The Vraxian hegemony had ruled the stars for 10,000 years. After the council session ended, Tyverus received orders that made his blood turn cold. He was to serve as military liaison to the human contingent and coordinate their involvement in the defense of the outer territories. This was clearly a punishment for his vocal opposition to the alliance, and Tyverus knew that his rivals in high command were laughing at him. Right now, he reported to the human staging area on the station and met their military commander. General Sarah Chun was a small woman with gray streaks in her black hair and old scars on her hands that spoke of past battles. She welcomed Tyverus with that same strange smile all humans seemed to wear, and offered him something called coffee, which he declined. The soldiers moved around the staging area with a casual attitude that bordered on negligence. They joked with each other and laughed, and slapped each other on the backs, and showed none of the rigid discipline that Vraxian troops displayed. Some of them were playing a game with a small ball, while others sat in circles. Sharing food and stories, Tyverus watched one young human male accidentally trip over a supply crate, and his companions erupted into loud laughter instead of punishing him for the error. These were the warriors who would stand beside Vraxian legions against the Devour Swarm. Tyverus returned to his quarters that night and composed a private transmission to Vraxian High Command. He wrote that the humans were hopelessly unprepared for the reality of war against the Devourers, and that their casual attitude would lead to catastrophic losses, and that the Coalition had made a grave mistake. He concluded with words that he would remember for the rest of his life. "We have allied ourselves with prey animals." The next morning, General Chun requested a meeting, and Tyverus expected her to ask for advanced weapons or Vraxian military technology, or perhaps protected positions behind the front lines. Instead, she asked for a minor staging ground in the Kethany corridor. This was a dangerous region filled with asteroid fields and unstable gravitational wells, and it served as a transit zone between Coalition space and Devour territory. Tiberius was confused by the request because no sensible commander would want such a vulnerable position. He granted it immediately because he assumed the humans simply did not understand the tactical situation, and he was not going to waste time explaining it to them. The human fleet departed within 6 hours, and Tiberius watched their ships leave with a mixture of relief and pity. They had brought only 12 destroyers and 4 cruisers and 2 carriers to this war, and now they were positioning themselves directly in the path of potential. Devourer Incursion's General Chun thanked him for his cooperation before she left, and Tiberius noticed something strange in her eyes. There was no fear there and no hesitation, and something that looked almost like anticipation. He dismissed it as human ignorance because they simply did not know what was coming. 3 days later, the long-range sensors detected a Devourer probe fleet entering the Kethany corridor. Tiberius counted the enemy ships and felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. 47 Devourer vessels against 18 human ships. The mathematics were simple and brutal, and by morning, he would be writing reports about the loss of the entire human contingent. He almost felt sorry for them because they had no idea what they were facing. The Devourers did not take prisoners, and they did not negotiate, and they did not stop until everything in their path was consumed. Tiberius settled into his command chair and activated the long-range observation systems. He would watch the battle and document human tactics for future reference, and then he would recommend to High Command that the coalition seek more suitable allies. He expected the engagement to last perhaps 2 hours at most. He had no idea that everything he believed about warfare was about to be proven wrong. Tiberius watched the tactical display as the Devourer fleet closed in on the human position, and he leaned forward in his command chair with grim anticipation. The enemy ships moved like a swarm of hungry insects, and their bioorganic hulls pulsed with sickly green light as they detected prey ahead. 47 against 18 was not a battle but a slaughter, and Tiberius had already begun composing his after-action report in his mind. He expected the humans to run because that was what any sensible species would do when facing such overwhelming odds. Standard coalition doctrine called for immediate retreat. When outnumbered more than 3 to 1, and the humans were facing nearly triple that ratio, but the human ships did not run. Tiberius blinked his secondary eyes and checked the sensor readings again, because surely there was some malfunction. The human fleet was not retreating, and it was not even holding position. It was advancing. General Chun's voice came through the communication channel, calm and steady, as if she were discussing the weather rather than leading her people into certain death. All ships confirm battle stations and prepare for close engagement. Tiberius opened a channel to the human flagship and demanded to know what they were doing. He told them that retreat was the only logical option and that they would be destroyed if they continued this course. General Chun's response made no sense to him. She said that retreat was not part of the plan. The Devourer fleet accelerated toward the humans, and Tiberius watched as the distance between them shrank rapidly. Then the humans did something that confused him even more. They slowed down, their ships reduced speed, and allowed the Devourers to close the gap faster, and Tiberius could not understand what possible tactical advantage this provided. A Raxian officer beside him suggested that the humans had frozen in fear, and that their primitive minds had simply shut down in the face of death. Tiberius was not so sure. The first exchange of fire lit up the tactical display, and Tiberius saw human shields flare and fail under the concentrated assault. A destroyer called the Jakarta took hits along its entire port side and atmosphere. Vented from multiple breaches, any Raxian ship would have pulled back to preserve combat effectiveness, but the Jakarta pushed forward into the heart of the enemy formation. Its weapons fired continuously, even as more sections of the hull were torn away. Then the Jakarta did something that made Tiberius stand up from his chair in shock. The crippled destroyer accelerated to maximum thrust and aimed itself directly at a Devourer carrier 10 times its size. The collision created an explosion that destroyed both ships and sent debris tearing through 3 more Devourer vessels. "A Taos, Aven," Raxian tactical officer whispered that the humans had just sacrificed themselves deliberately. Tyverus could not respond because he was watching more human ships take damage that should have forced them to withdraw. The cruiser Defiance lost its main engines and drifted helplessly as Devourers surrounded it. Instead of surrendering, the crew overloaded their reactor core, and the resulting blast took out 2 enemy frigates. "General," Chun's voice came through the channel again, still impossibly calm. "All units, this is Winchester Protocol. And, I repeat, Winchester Protocol. Make them pay for every inch." Tyverus did not know what Winchester Protocol meant, but he was beginning to understand what he was witnessing. These humans knew they were going to die, and they had accepted it. And they had decided that their deaths would cost the enemy dearly. The battle raged for 4 hours, and Tyverus watched every minute of it with growing disbelief. Human ships that should have been dead continued fighting with sections of their hulls missing and fires burning through their corridors. Escape pods launched, but not away from the battle, and instead directly into enemy ships where the human crews detonated personal explosives. One human pilot broadcasting on an open channel flew his damaged fighter directly into the bridge section of a Devourer command ship while playing loud music that Tyverus did not recognize. The pilot was laughing as he died. When the battle finally ended, Tyverus stared at the tactical display in silence. The human fleet had been reduced to 7 ships, and all of them were heavily damaged, and over 4,000 human soldiers were dead. But the Devourer probe fleet was gone, not retreated and not scattered, but completely annihilated. Every single enemy vessel had been destroyed. Tyverus reviewed the combat logs, and the numbers made no sense according to everything he knew about warfare. The humans had fought with no regard for acceptable loss ratios, and no consideration for tactical withdrawal, and no apparent concern for their own survival. They had fought like they expected to die, and simply decided to take as many enemies with them as possible. A Vraxian commander would never accept such losses, and would never sacrifice ships so freely, and would never continue fighting when victory was mathematically impossible. But the humans had not calculated the odds of victory. They had only calculated the cost they could inflict. Tyverus left the command center and walked through the corridors of the station in a daze. He encountered a human officer near the medical bay and stopped to stare at her. She was young, with bandages covering burns on her arms and exhaustion written across her face, but she stood straight and met his gaze without flinching. She had been on one of the surviving ships, and Tyverus could see in her eyes that she had watched her friends die. He asked her how they did it and how they kept fighting when any rational being would have fled. The human woman smiled, and the expression was nothing like the friendly smiles he had seen before. This smile was old and hard, and carried the weight of something ancient and terrifying. She asked if this was his first time seeing humans fight, and Tyverus nodded slowly. The woman's smile widened, and she leaned closer and spoke words that Tyverus would never forget. "That was just the screening force, Commander." She walked away and left Tyverus standing alone in the corridor. He thought about the 4,000 humans who had died today and the impossible victory they had achieved. Then he thought about the humans saying he had dismissed as primitive boasting, "If we go down, we take you with us." For the first time in his 300 years, Tyverus Call felt afraid. 2 weeks after the battle in the Kethany corridor, Tyverus submitted a formal request for transfer to the human forces. His superiors were confused by this because liaison duty with the humans was considered a punishment, and no Vraxian officer had ever requested it voluntarily. Tyverus did not explain his reasons because he was not sure he understood them himself. He only knew that he needed to understand what he had witnessed, and that meant embedding himself with the humans directly. General Chun approved his request without hesitation and assigned him to the 144th Combined Arms Division stationed on the moon of Keth 4. This was a forward operating base, less than 3 days' travel from Devourer. Controlled space and Tyverus arrived, expecting to find soldiers preparing for death. Instead, he found something far more disturbing. The humans were training. They ran in formation around the base perimeter, carrying heavy packs on their backs and their feet pounding against the rocky ground in perfect rhythm. Tyverus watched them for an hour, and they did not stop. Some of them fell from exhaustion, and their companions picked them up and forced them to keep moving. A human sergeant named Rodriguez noticed Tyverus watching and jogged over to explain. She called this activity physical training and said they did it every morning before breakfast. Tyverus asked why they would exhaust themselves before eating, and Rodriguez laughed like he had told a joke. She said this was how humans prepared their bodies for war, and that a tired soldier in training was a strong soldier in battle. Over the following days, Tyverus observed the humans constantly, and everything he saw challenged his understanding of warfare. They practiced hand-to-hand combat for hours even, though such fighting was considered primitive and obsolete. They ran obstacle courses until their muscles failed, and then they ran them again. They swam in freezing water and marched through harsh terrain and carried wounded companions on their backs for kilometers. A Vraxian soldier trained to be efficient and deadly in short bursts of combat. Human soldiers trained to endure. Sergeant Rodriguez invited Tyverus to join one of their training sessions, and he accepted because he wanted to prove that Vraxian superiority extended to physical endurance. The first hour was easy, and Tyverus kept pace with the humans without difficulty. The second hour was harder, but he refused to show weakness. By the third hour, his forelegs were burning, and his lungs ached, and his scales had turned a pale gray from exhaustion. The humans were still running. Tyverus collapsed at the 4-hour mark, and the humans helped him to his feet with encouraging words and genuine smiles. They had been running for 6 hours when they finally stopped. Rodriguez sat beside Tyverus in the medical bay while his muscles were treated for strain. She told him about something called endurance hunting and explained how ancient humans survived on their homeworld. They were not the fastest predators, and not the strongest, and not the most deadly, but they were the ones who never stopped. Human ancestors would chase prey across vast distances for days at a time, and the prey would run faster at first, but eventually it would tire. The humans would keep coming at a steady pace, never stopping and never resting, and the prey would run and run until its heart exploded from exhaustion. Rodriguez smiled that ancient smile Tyverus was learning to recognize. She said humans were not designed to win quickly, and they were designed to be the last ones standing when everything else had given up. Tyverus began reading human history, and what he found kept him awake at night. He learned about their world wars where millions died in trenches fighting over meters of ground for years at a time. He learned about sieges that lasted for months and cities that refused to surrender, even as their people starved. He read about a place called Stalingrad, where humans fought building by building and room by room and hand to hand in frozen streets while their civilization burned around them. He read about islands in their Pacific Ocean where human soldiers fought to the death rather than retreat, and where surrender was considered worse than dying. A Vraxian war lasted months at most because such extended conflict was considered inefficient. Humans had fought wars that lasted for generations. Tyverus asked General Chun how her people could endure such suffering, and she looked at him with those calm, steady eyes. She said that humans had a concept called acceptable losses that allowed them to continue fighting, even when the cost was staggering. She said they also had a concept called victory at any cost that other species found horrifying. When Tyrus asked what that meant, General Chun told him about something called total war. She explained that when humans were pushed far enough, they did not just fight enemy soldiers, but they destroyed enemy cities and enemy farms and enemy factories and everything that allowed the enemy to continue existing. She said her people had done this to themselves multiple times throughout their history. Tyrus felt his scales turn cold as he realized what he was learning. Raxians fought for honor and territory and resources. Humans fought to end things permanently. The alert sirens activated 3 weeks into his assignment, and Tyrus rushed to the command center. Long-range sensors had detected the main Devourer fleet approaching, and the numbers made his blood freeze. 40,000 ships were coming, and this was not a probe force, but a full invasion armada. The coalition commanders began planning immediate evacuation to defensible positions deeper in Allied territory. This was standard doctrine when facing overwhelming force, and retreat would preserve their forces to fight another day. Then, the human admiral sent a single transmission that changed everything. His name was Admiral James Morrison, and his voice was steady and calm and absolutely certain. The message was simple: we hold here and retreat is not authorized. Tyrus looked at General Chun and asked if the admiral was serious. She nodded and began issuing orders to her troops. The humans were going to stand against 40,000 Devourer ships with a fleet of less than 2,000. They were going to fight knowing they would probably die, and somehow the thought of standing beside them made Tyrus feel more alive than he had in centuries. The Battle of the Varanthos Line began at dawn, and Tyrus commanded a Vraxian battle group from the bridge of the carrier. Unconquered pride around him in the vast darkness of space, the combined fleet of the Galactic Coalition formed a defensive formation that stretched across 3 million kilometers. Human ships held the center of the line, and Vraxian vessels anchored the flanks, and Crethony cruisers provided long-range fire support. It was the largest military force ever assembled by the Coalition. It was not enough. The Devourer Armada emerged from hyperspace like a living nightmare, and Tyrus felt his heart stop as the tactical display tried to count the enemy vessels. 40,000 ships filled with billions of absorbed organisms, all connected to a single hungry mind that knew only one purpose: consume everything. Admiral Morrison's voice came through the fleet channel, calm and steady as always. All ships hold formation and wait for my command, and remember what we are fighting for. The Devourers did not waste time with communication or threats. They simply attacked. The first wave crashed against the Coalition line like a tide of darkness, and Tyrus watched as ships on both sides were torn apart. In the opening minutes, Vraxian destroyers fired their weapons until their barrels melted, and Crethony cruisers burned in the void, and still the Devourers kept coming. But the humans did something different. Where other species fought to survive, the humans fought with something that Tyrus had never seen before. They fought with spite. A human carrier called the Remembrance took a direct hit to its reactor, and everyone knew the ship was dying. Instead of evacuating, the crew sealed the breaches and continued fighting, and the captain broadcast a message on all channels. She said they were not done yet. The Remembrance flew directly into a cluster of Devourer command ships with all weapons firing, and the explosion, when it finally came, destroyed 17 enemy vessels. The crew never tried to escape. They had chosen to make their deaths count across the line. Tyrus watched more human ships make the same choice. Damaged vessels that should have retreated instead accelerated toward the enemy. Pilots whose fighters were crippled rammed their craft into Devourer weak points. Marines whose ships were boarded activated explosives rather than be consumed and threw at all the humans. Broadcast music on open channels. Tyvrus did not understand the songs, but he understood the message behind them. The humans were not afraid. They were defiant. The ground battle on the planet below was even worse, and Tyvrus received reports throughout the day as the fighting raged. Human soldiers dug into positions and refused to move even when they were surrounded. They fought for hours without sleep and without food and without hope of reinforcement. A Braxian commander reported that a human platoon had held a bridge for 9 hours against continuous assault. When he finally reached their position, he found only 7 humans still alive out of 40. They were wounded and exhausted, and they asked him when the next wave was coming. One human private had lost both legs to enemy fire and could not walk. Instead of waiting for medical evacuation, she had dragged herself forward with her arms and used her last grenade to destroy an enemy position that threatened her squad. Her final words before she died were reported across the military network. "Tell my mom I did not quit." Tyvrus felt something change in his chest when he heard those words. He had spent 300 years believing that honor in battle meant fighting well and dying with dignity. The humans had shown him something different. They did not fight for honor. They fought because giving up was simply not an option. As the battle continued, the Vraxian soldiers around Tyvrus began to change. They watched the humans die and refused to stop, and something ancient stirred in their warrior hearts. A Vraxian captain whose ship was badly damaged sent a message to Tyvrus asking for permission to withdraw. Tyvrus looked at the human ship still fighting around them and thought about the private who had crawled forward with no legs. He denied the request. The captain's scales flickered with surprise and then with understanding. His ship turned back toward the enemy. By nightfall, the coalition had lost nearly half its fleet, and the Devourers had lost more than they had ever lost before. Human casualties were catastrophic, with over 30,000 dead in a single day of fighting. That the line had held. The Devourers had never faced anything like human determination, and their advance had stalled and then stopped. Admiral Morrison ordered the fleet to hold position and prepare for the next assault. His voice was tired but unbroken. "Tomorrow we push back." Tyvrus found the admiral later in the command center, staring at a screen filled with names. These were the humans who had died today, and Morrison was reading each one. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were dry, and his voice was steady when he spoke. He said he would remember all of them. Tyvrus asked how the admiral could bear such loss and how he could continue giving orders that sent his people to die. Morrison looked at him with eyes that had seen too much death and carried too much responsibility. He said that every human who died today had chosen to be here. They had known the odds, and they had come anyway, because some things were worth dying for. He said humans did not fight because they wanted to die. They fought because they wanted the ones they loved to live. Tyvrus thought about his own people and their ancient warrior traditions and their songs of glorious death in battle. He realized that humans did not sing about glorious death. They sang about what they were protecting, and somehow that made them more terrifying than any species he had ever known. 1 year after the Battle of the Varantos Line, Tyvrus Kal stood before the Vraxian High Council in the ancient Chamber of Judgment. Behind him, through the great crystal windows, the stars burned in the eternal darkness. Among those stars was a system that no longer posed any threat to the galaxy. The Devour homeworld was a field of ash and debris scattered across 1 billion kilometers of space. The war was over. The High Council had summoned Tyvrus to deliver his assessment of the human species and their role in the victory. This was a formal requirement for any military alliance, and Tyvrus had spent weeks preparing his report. But standing here now, he found that his prepared words seemed inadequate. High Counselor Rex spoke first, and her voice echoed through the ancient chamber. She asked Tyvrus to share what he had learned about humanity during his service alongside them. Tyvrus stepped forward and felt the weight of 1,000 Vraxian eyes upon him. He began by admitting that he had been wrong. 1 year ago, he had called humans prey animals and had dismissed them as weak and soft and unsuitable for war. He had watched them smile and laugh and play games and had concluded that they did not understand the reality of combat. He had been a fool. Tyverus described the battle in the Kethany corridor, where 18 human ships had destroyed 47 Devourer vessels. He explained that the humans had not won through superior technology or tactics. They had won because they refused to accept defeat, even when defeat was certain. He told the council about the doctrine of endurance and how human ancestors had survived by simply outlasting everything else. He described their training methods that pushed soldiers to exhaustion and beyond until their bodies learned that stopping was not an option. He spoke of human history and the wars they had fought against themselves. He told the council about trenches where soldiers lived in mud for years and cities that burned while their defenders refused to surrender, and battles fought with sticks and stones by humans who had run out of ammunition, but not out of will. A young counselor interrupted to ask if humans were simply too primitive to understand when they were beaten. Tyverus shook his head. He said that humans understood defeat perfectly well. They simply chose not to accept it. He described the concept of heroism that humans celebrated throughout their culture. Their stories and songs and monuments were filled with people who had sacrificed themselves for others. A Vraxian who died in battle died for personal glory and family honor. A human who died in battle died so that others might live. The council asked about the final assault on the Devourer homeworld, and Tyverus felt old grief stir in his chest. He explained that the mission had been classified as suicide with a 0% chance of survival. Admiral Morrison had asked for volunteers only and made clear that no one would be ordered to go. Every single human soldier had stepped forward. Tyverus had been with them on that final mission, and he had watched them prepare for death with quiet determination. They wrote letters to their families and recorded messages for their children and made peace with their gods. Then they boarded their ships and flew into the heart of the enemy. The Devourer homeworld had been defended by 10,000 ships and orbital platforms and ground installations that could destroy fleets. The humans had broken through anyway. They had lost ship after ship, and the survivors had kept going, and when their vessels were destroyed, they had rammed the debris into enemy positions. The final bomb had been delivered by a single human pilot whose name was Lieutenant Maria Santos. Her ship had been torn apart by enemy fire, and her crew was dead, and she was bleeding from wounds that would have killed any other species. She had flown her dying ship into the heart of the Devourer central mind and detonated a weapon that erased everything within 1,000 kilometers. Her last transmission had been picked up by Coalition sensors. She had said simply that she was coming home. The council chamber was silent for a long moment. High Counselor Vrex asked a question that Tyverus had known was coming. She asked if humanity was a threat to the Vraxian hegemony and the other coalition species. Tyverus considered his answer carefully because he understood the weight of this moment. He said that humans were not a threat as long as the coalition never gave them a reason to fight. He explained that they were small and fragile and short-lived creatures who loved peace and art and the laughter of their children. They built gardens and wrote poetry and spent their brief lives creating beautiful things. They did not want war, but when war came to them, they transformed into something else entirely. Tyverus described the human saying he had heard most often during his service: "If we go down, we take you with us." He told the council that this was not a boast or a threat. It was a promise. Humans did not fight to conquer or dominate. They fought to protect what they loved, and when what they loved was threatened, they would not stop until the threat was gone or they were dead. There was no negotiation with human determination and no compromise with human resolve, and no surviving human vengeance once it was unleashed. The council asked for his final assessment, and Tyverus straightened his scales and spoke the truth. He said that he had thought humans were weak allies when he first met them. He had been wrong. They were the single most terrifying species he had ever encountered, and not because of their weapons or their ships or their technology. They were terrifying because they had mastered the one thing no other species in the galaxy had learned. They had found a way to weaponize hope. A human soldier fighting for their family would not stop, because stopping meant their children might die. A human pilot crashing into an enemy ship was not committing suicide because they believed their sacrifice would save someone they loved. A human species facing extinction would not surrender because surrender meant the end of everything they had ever built. Hope made them impossible to break. Love made them impossible to stop. The council dismissed Tyverus with honors, and he walked out of the ancient chamber into the light of the Vraxian sun. He thought about the humans he had served with, and the ones who had died, and the ones who were now returning to their small blue world to rebuild their lives. He thought about Lieutenant Santos flying into the heart of darkness with a smile on her face. He thought about the private who had crawled forward with no legs because quitting was not in her nature. He thought about Admiral Morrison reading the names of the dead and promising to remember them all. Tyverus Call had served the Vraxian military for 300 years and had seen 1,000 battles. He had never been afraid until he met humanity. Now, he understood that fear was not weakness. It was wisdom, because any species that could turn hope into a weapon and love into armor and sacrifice into victory was a species that should never be underestimated. The humans were going home now, and they would plant their gardens and raise their children and write their songs. And somewhere in the universe, another species might look at them and see small, soft creatures without claws or armor. That species would be making the same mistake Tyverus had made. They would learn the truth eventually. Everyone did.